There's a specific kind of silence you only find in the deep wilderness. It's not the absence of noise, it's the presence of something waiting. My name is Elias. I spent 15 years wearing the green and gray of the U.S. National Park Service. I've seen it all. The tourists who think bears are overgrown Labradors, the hikers who wander off trail with nothing but a 12-ounce bottle of water and a prayer, and the suicides who come to the mountains to find a quiet place to end. But there is one case, one file that doesn't exist in the official archives that kept me from ever entering the woods again after my retirement. It happened in the summer of 2014 in a section of the North Cascades we called the Dead Zone. It wasn't called that because people died there. It was called that because nothing lived there. No birds, no squirrels, not even the hum of a mosquito. It was just an emerald green cathedral of ancient, suffocating pine. The call that changed everything. It was 4:15 p.m. on a Tuesday. I was finishing a shift at the ranger station when the radio crackled to life. It wasn't the usual static. It was a high-pitched rhythmic clicking, followed by a voice so distorted it sounded like it was being filtered through a mouthful of gravel. Search and rescue. We have a code purple at the basin. Repeat, code purple. My blood turned to ice. A code purple wasn't in the manual. It was a handshake code, something used only by senior rangers to indicate a disappearance that defied logic. I grabbed my pack, my radio, and, against regulations for a standard SAR mission, my personal .357 Magnum. When I arrived at the trailhead of the Granite Basin, I found Ranger Miller. Miller was a 20-year veteran, a guy who had stitched his own legs shut after a rock slide. He was sitting on the bumper of his truck, staring at his hands. They were shaking. "Who is it, Miller?" I asked, my voice low. "The Henderson kid, Toby, 7 years old. The parents say they were 10 feet behind him. He rounded a bend in the trail. Just one bend, Elias, and when they turned the corner 3 seconds later, he was gone." The first anomaly. We started the ascent. The parents had already been escorted back to the station, hysterical. Usually, when a kid goes missing, they leave a trail, a dropped juice box, a scuff mark in the dirt, a crying voice. We reached the bend Miller mentioned. The trail here was narrow, flanked by a sheer rock wall on the left and a 500-foot drop-off into the tree line on the right. There was nowhere for a 7-year-old to go. He couldn't have climbed the wall, and if he'd fallen, we would have seen the broken branches below. "Look at the ground," Miller said, pointing his flashlight even though it was still daylight. I knelt. The trail was covered in fine gray dust, remnants of crushed shale. There in the center of the path were Toby's footprints, small sneaker tread marks. They led toward the bend, spaced evenly. Then they just stopped. Not a scuffle, no sign of a struggle. The last footprint was a full indentation of his right foot, and then nothing. The dust ahead was perfectly smooth, undisturbed by wind or step. It was as if the boy had simply been edited out of reality. The sound of the unseen. We pushed deeper into the dead zone, following the direction Toby should have been walking. As the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks, the temperature plummeted. That's when the silence hit us. In the Cascades, you always hear the wind. You hear the creak of the Douglas firs. But as we stepped over the invisible line into the basin, the world went mute. My own breathing sounded like a freight train in my ears. "Do you feel that?" Miller whispered. "The pressure?" I asked. It felt like being underwater. My ears popped, and then I heard it. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a cry for help. It was the sound of a child laughing. But the rhythm was wrong. It was too fast, like a record being played at double speed. Ha 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 ha. "Toby?" Miller yelled, his voice sounding flat and dead in heavy air. The laughter stopped. A moment later, it started again, but this time it wasn't a laugh. It was Miller's voice. "Toby!" Miller yelled, his voice sounding flat and dead in the heavy air. The forest had just repeated my own internal thoughts and Miller's words back to us, perfectly mimicked, but in a voice that sounded like it was vibrating out of the trees themselves. The discovery on the peak. We ran. We shouldn't have, but instinct took over. We followed the sound toward a clearing dominated by a massive flat-topped boulder, a glacial erratic left behind from the Ice Age. On top of that boulder, 20 feet in the air, with no visible way to climb it, sat a pair of shoes, Toby's sneakers. They were placed neatly, side by side, heels touching. They were perfectly clean, no mud, no dust, no scuffs. Next to them was Toby's bright red windbreaker, folded into a perfect square. "Toby!" I screamed, aiming my light at the top of the rock. A face peered over the edge. It looked like Toby. It had his blonde hair, his small nose, his wide eyes. But as it looked down at us, the jaw began to drop. It kept dropping, past the chin, past the neck, until its mouth was a yawning black void that stretched down to its chest. It didn't have teeth. It had rows of what looked like needle-thin, translucent cilia vibrating in the dark. And then it spoke. It didn't use Toby's voice this time. It used the voice of the radio dispatcher from earlier that afternoon. "Search and rescue. We have a code purple at the basin. Repeat, code purple."